What knowledge do you need to deliver which tasks? So that's essentially the definition of a skill. Now, when you look at it, and in the day and age that we have now gotten into with AI coming in, one of the primary problems that any organization would want to solve for is try and understand this universe of AI tools available, the universe of skills a job requires, and then being able to connect the two. And that would actually lead to a more modern way of working where AI enables humans. One part of the equation is the tools, understanding how AI tools help, and the second part of the equation is how do AI tools help in the job. And to understand that part, that's where skills come in. Until unless we understand what are the skills, how do you define it, does that link back to the process, the strategy of the company, we'll not be able to make the most of the AI tools. At least that's my perspective. That's why I feel this entire transformation around skills becomes even more important.
Hey Arkesh, I'm really excited to have you today. It's been great to get to know you through the CL Exchange Network. Looking forward to this conversation.
Hey Vince, good afternoon. Yeah, same here, man. I mean, really look forward to this conversation.
And what really excited me is, the skills-based transformation is all the talk nowadays with, big enterprises. You're really spearheading this work right now. So let's dive into it. Maybe
Sure.
the first question here is, why is skills-based transformation so relevant today?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Vince. So before I dive into why skill-based transformation is really relevant, let's talk a little bit about skills, right? So skills basically outline what knowledge do you need to deliver which tasks. So that's essentially the definition of a skill. The definition goes in knowledge, skills, abilities, and skills are basically tasks. Now, when you look at it, and in the day and age that we have now gotten into with AI coming in, one of the primary problems that any organization would want to solve for is try and understand this universe of tools, AI tools available, the universe of skills that that a job requires, and then being able to connect the two. And that would actually lead to, I would say, to a more modern way of working where AI enables humans. If you look at that equation, there are two parts to the equation. One part of the equation is the tools, understanding how AI tools help, and the second part of the equation is how do AI tools help in the job. And to understand that part, that's where skills come in. So until unless we understand what are the skills, how do you define it, does that link back to the process, the strategy of the company, we'll not be able to make the most of the AI tools. At least that's my perspective. So that's why I feel this entire transformation around skills becomes even more important.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense that it forms a foundation on which you can really build the AI transformation.
Yeah.
I know you're building this capability framework. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about it? And
Sure.
also, what are some of the top lessons you've learned as you build this from scratch for such a large organization?
Sure. So let me take a step back and and talk about how we've built this in iterations over the past many years. So we've been on a skills journey for a number of years now, and I was leading this body of work for the global tech organization almost 4 or 5 years back. And at that point of time, the vision that I had, Vince, was to basically make skills capabilities as the foundation to our talent model. And what I mean by that was, we started off by saying, okay, so if I understood across job families, software engineers, data scientists, network engineers, operational analysts, and so on, what skills, capabilities, and competencies are required to perform the job, which was basically a derivation of the processes and the strategy that we wanted to deliver to. Once, we defined that, we linked it back to hiring, we linked it back to rewards, we linked it back to promotions, we linked it back to learning, and, we revamped a lot of our processes, revamped a lot of the talent processes around that. We were able to link all of that to a common denominator. As we've progressed through the years, and this framework, we launched in 2021, it's gone through a couple of iterations now. So in the latest iteration, what we're basically trying to do is we're trying to, bring in the entire integration of how AI starts to influence these jobs. How do we, create these processes in integration with AI, and how do people who are software engineers or data scientists, how do they leverage AI in their jobs across levels? That's essentially what we're trying to do here. So the base framework in terms of how we define skills and connected it back to everything talent, performance, and rewards, that's already established. Now that, we're refreshing the competencies and skills, we should be able to then again, go back and refresh the way we hire, reward, promote, and, and the learning academy.
Interesting. What was great is that you already had a foundation there.
Right.
But the idea is that you have to sort of adjust it and refine it for the age of AI. Because the tasks that humans do versus not changes in this world. Could you share a little bit, what does an adjustment look like? And what are some top insights you've gotten as you grapple with the existing one, started making changes?
So I'll give two examples. That's the change, in the way we operate in our jobs. And I'll share one from, my work, daily life. as people practitioner, and then I'll share one more from software engineering. So let's say if I have to write an email announcement, or if I have to send something out to the larger audience of the 12,000 tech associates that I support, my natural instinct to go in and start typing a first draft and get it out, right? Now I have unadjusted, to your point, unadjusted to a point where my first instinct now over the last 6 months is not to go and start writing a first draft, but actually to go to the enterprise ChatGPT that we have and start feeding it prompts in terms of what I'm looking for, what's the context, what is my typical communication style. And I've fed some of my earlier communication to ChatGPT to train in my like communication style. So that's the adjustment. Instead of going and starting to start to craft the communication, I go and feed the prompt, and ChatGPT provides the first draft. And I would say, Vince, over a period of time, the first drafts from ChatGPT have become so good, I'm almost able to copy paste and send it out. An email announcement, or communication, or set of guidelines we want to send out, that's almost there. So that's an adjustment from a people practitioner point of view. When I look from a software engineering perspective, and this is where we did a bunch of focus groups to understand how software engineers using the Gen AI tools, one of the things that we've heard from software engineers is the first draft of the code, they're using Copilot to generate that, and then spending more time in terms of reviewing the code and making sure it sort of fits the requirement, rather than going and actually spending time writing the first unedited draft. So it's a very similar parallels, but the way we get started, where do we add value versus where do we don't, that's sort of starting to shift. This does make the amount of time we spend in creating final output, this reduces that a lot, and the throughput definitely increases the number of things you can do over a period of time. That definitely goes up. Yeah.
And in those two examples that you share, which resonates a lot, like the actual skill required from the person is different. Are you evolving that too in your current thinking, where you're actually articulating, okay, well, before, let's say in the people example you gave, you actually needed to be very good at like literally writing, like you should formulate good sentences, good grammar and all of that.
Right.
Now you might be like, no, you got to be able to read and like critically think through something and maybe copy edit. I don't even know if that's as relevant, versus get the right tone, figure out the right audience to get the right nuance, different kind of skills. So how are you adjusting also the skill expectation as the tasks evolve?
Yeah. So Vince, that's a really good question. And you've been a consultant. I'll talk about it in 3 stages. So let's take this particular example of, let's say you are sending out a communication announcement. So there are 3 parts to it. One is the meta thinking that goes behind the thinking to, put the structure in. To say, this is what I'm trying to solve for. This is, these are the broad, messages that I want to send, and, this is how I want it to get delivered, and so on. There's an audience and so on. Then comes the actual message that you have to craft, and then, comes the finesse on top of it to, put the layers in. When you look at least this is my observation, having used, these Gen AI tools for a year and a half now, I would say the focus between these 3 bodies of work, those 3 bodies of work exist, but the focus in terms of where do you spend your time, that shifts. The last, 10-15 years for people like us, we don't really spend a lot of time in the first one, because that's sort of now wired into our thinking. So straight away jump into the second part to start to craft the message, because in your brain you've already figured that out. Now what happens is, when you are using ChatGPT, it's like going back and putting more efforts into meta thinking, because now it is going to be generating the second part of it, the body of the communication, where you would end up spending a lot more time, but ChatGPT takes care of it. So you're spending a lot more time in the meta thinking, the thinking behind the thinking, and then you spend time in terms of of it, as the ChatGPT model or any Gen AI model gets trained on it. So I would say, if I was to take the 3 parts, which is the meta thinking, the structure piece of it, the actual time spent in terms of crafting the communication, and then the finesse, I would say the focus has shifted to the thinking and structure, and not so much to the second and the third portions of it, because the Gen AI tools take care of that. That's the way the focus has shifted, and that's where we also end up saving time that would have otherwise spent on these kinds of work.
Is this kind of thinking getting baked into your capability framework and how it gets used?
So, this actually segues into this research that I was sharing with you in our earlier.
Yeah. Let's go into it.
Yeah. So, a few months back, I came across this framework that Stanford had released. So they're calling it the human agency scale. And what they basically did was, they created a sample size of almost 1,000, AI experts and 1,000 workers. And then they went around understanding the tasks and the way, employees were using Gen AI tools on these tasks. And what they came out was very fascinating. So what they created was a scale of 1 to to 5, H1 to H5. And what they're talking about is if you were to look at this human agency scale between H1 to H5, H1 and H2 are basically AI-led tasks, which is where the AI actually completes the task and human involvement is very low. H3 is where there is equal partnership between, AI and human, and H4 and H5 are basically human-led tasks to completion. Now, if you were to look at that, then I started playing around with this framework. I fed some of our, skill models, competency models, and started to get Gen AI, ChatGPT to generate what does it mean from, the competency perspective, start to, rate them on H1 to H5, which tools would you use and how. What became very clear was when you look at H1 and H2, those tasks and the example that I was sharing with you, the GenAI tool can be easily trained, like communication or initial first drafts or, building a framework. That's where, we are seeing the maximum use of GenAI tools come in. Those tasks that require a fair degree of communication, human interface, where understanding, the human aspect of the interaction is going to be more and more important. AI can give you suggestions, but it's still, very early stages where, it's still required the human to be deeply involved and, drive the task to complete. AI is becoming really good at analysis, but again, you have to check for hallucination and, figure out, okay, so this is the analysis and this is my inference. So I'd say that's somewhere in the middle and as an H3. Vince, to answer your question, I would say that there are, models out there which can help us understand how much automation is possible in which particular tasks and skill across each job. And, I feel we should start using something like this to help us, have a higher adoption of AI tools.
How has your organization's adoption and uptake of this framework and sort of incorporation into capability framework? Is it pretty widely accepted? Is there a lot of pushback?
We've been very open to adopting Gen AI tools and very open. We've given access to pretty much all our associates to Copilot. And, a lot of our associates have access to ChatGPT Enterprise version and, GitHub Copilot for coders and so on. What we're trying to do is we're trying to, lead with the agentic experience. What that means is when, our customers shop with us, we want them to be, shopping through an agent. And that's where, we've introduced Sparky. And if you go to our app, you will see that. So that's the way, we want our customers to be shopping with us. One of the ways for them to be shopping with us. For our internal developers, we've built something called as Vibe. That's where, the developer should be able to use that and, go around, with the software development process. The same goes, for our associates. We've introduced something called as Quickly, which is essentially going to help our associates across, home office associates, our frontline associates, basically, use that. And for our sellers, suppliers, advertisers, we basically, we've introduced something called as Marty. Now, when you look at these 4 super agents, they are essentially going to be helping our stakeholders sort of interact and leverage that for their interactions with us. We are driving a lot of adoption through that. The way we are going about doing that is adopting it into our everyday lives, trying to see what are the use cases, being very open and continuing to leverage it into our jobs. Now, is it completely framework driven? I would say it's more use case driven at this point of time, and we are trying to see in which job how these tools sort of fit and how do we make the most out of it. I have shared a lot of my perspective. What I'd love to hear from you is what are you seeing from the industry? What is your perspective, the way, organizations are adopting Gen AI tools?
There are a few thoughts that come to my mind. One, I think it's very different. I see folks that are pretty far ahead and also folks that are like early or in the world where they're saying, we're going to let the industry leaders figure it out and we're going to fast follow, right? And that's a real strategy that a lot of firms have. Now, an organization like Walmart, which is clear an industry leader in this segment, will always be kind of the front running. Right. There's no one else to really follow. And so in particular, I see the innovation happening faster in industries that just feel a lot more threatened by AI or is less like regulated, right? So if they have certain killer use cases where AI can really automate a lot of the work, I see that happening a lot faster. There are some organizations that have like figured out like a killer use case, and typically the way I think about it is they actually look at a specific business problem and then they really thought about the whole business process end to end and then reimagined it with like AI, and then usually that actually creates capturable savings. I've seen less success with organizations that just started by giving everyone, hey, like experiment, but then like, so everyone experiments, but maybe there's like efficiency and productivity here and there, but it doesn't really aggregate up to something transformative. That's something that I see. Now, I hadn't actually heard about the human agency scale framework, but I think something like that being used as a way to orient people's thinking in an organization seems really useful.
Yeah.
Because right now, I think people lack the language to talk about the nuances of use of AI in a given task and whether it's 100% of it or 50% of it or
Right.
20% of it. I think that discussion sometimes gets lost. That's why actually when you shared it with me, I thought, oh, this is quite cool. And I feel like more people should look into it.
I mean, at this point of time, as I was sharing earlier, there is this universe of, AI tools available and the universe of human tasks. And what is happening is we're leaving the associates and the employees in the middle to sort of choose your own adventure, figure out how you want to use the tools. I feel, somewhere we need to be able to provide that visibility or guidance to say, this is how you use this tool. Not a prescription, but, sort of a guidance or blueprint to say,
Inspiration.
like an inspiration or, put it that way. So, that sort of helps people get little bit more idea and not leave it entirely to their imagination. Yeah, I agree.
I've been in more and more conversations with organizations that say, hey, AI is a change management problem, much less than a tool problem, where the change management problem is part buy-in and actually people accepting it.
Right.
But two, getting to the point at which they realize, oh, this is actually useful. Because the first time you use it, if it's not very good, people say, wait, this is so overhyped, and then they give
Right.
up. And it requires a bit of a perseverance to get to a point where like, oh, this is my use case. You've already rolled out ChatGPT Enterprise across the org. You're probably seeing different levels of adoption across organization. How do you think about that change management process?
From a change management perspective, Vince, and I'll specifically talk about, the tech organization. So I would say there are three parts to it. One is leaders leading by example. The second part is, where you're constantly sort of reiterating that, hey, what, we do want you to, use these tools and we will support you, whatever you're sort of looking for. And third is actually training people on the use cases, and bringing people together, creating a community of experts who can, guide them. When you look at these three things, our leaders have been constantly messaging and, they've been leading with examples saying, hey, what, I use ChatGPT for this. I use Copilot for this. I am, regularly, doing these tasks using Gen AI tools. And that there's a lot of, leading by example over there. And when you look at the other pieces, we're spending a lot of time, particularly with our tech associates, on the use cases. How do they use these tools? Bringing in other engineers who've actually, built software, who've built codes using these tools, and, where are they using it? Is in the development process? Is it in the testing process? How does that look like? So we make it very real for our tech associates, and that's actually come in very handy. We are starting to see a higher and higher adoption. We are encouraging people to, go out there, start using it in everyday life. And the more, you're closer to the tool, you start to use it. Those are the ways we change managing it. As we get down further in this journey, there'll be more in terms of what are we learning, how much adoption have we had, what are we seeing work, what does not work. Like I'll give you an example. I was talking to a software engineering leader, and he said, the first draft that you get, it works really well for a POC, but once you start to scale that, that's where you need to make sure that the code fits into the system, it's able to scale. There are much lesser issues when you're starting to operationalize it and so on. So that's where a lot of focus goes into if you generate a code using ChatGPT or Copilot code. We're not restricting people to use it at all. In fact, we are on the opposite side of the spectrum, saying go ahead, use it. But at the same time, when you get into production, make sure that you're putting attention towards reviewing the code and you're sort of making sure it's operationable and so on.
Is there a particular skill gap that is emerging as you do this? Like, for example, as we discussed, the thought process and where people spend more time is a little different, right? Like with AI, in general, there's more debugging you have to do. Even when you write, you have to make sure the thing you wrote, there's no fake thing it has sort of added and stuff like that.
Right.
In code, I think it's very important that what goes into production is not a bunch of like buggy code. I'm curious, like if you've sort of noticed, oh, we actually have to really emphasize this skill in the capability framework in this AI world that's used to be sort of de-emphasized and so on.
I'd be in a better position to answer that question maybe, 6 months down the line where we've seen enough use cases. We know how it sort of worked out. I would say at this point of time, for example, and the same example I was sharing earlier, when I was talking to the software engineering leader, he said, Arkesh, when we are building this code out, we are seeing the default code that Copilot generates create a lot of containers which are empty. And he's like, then you have to go in and delete those containers and make sure that they don't end up taking space. And he's like, that's something who has not worked on the actual like code before, let's say pre-AI code before, would not know that, and you'll put that code into production. So it's a more than skill gaps, Vince. I think this is where, to my earlier example, now the focus is more on review versus the content generation. So people who have spent the time building that meta thinking, people who have spent time reviewing the code and know as well as to how to do the work somewhere in the middle. So if you look at the the scale of expertise, the beginner at the middle and, high end of the expert, people who are in the middle, I feel stand to benefit a lot because they've just, graduated into this space where, they're still, reviewing the code and they can build the code and so on. So again, this does not answer your question directly, but, that's my observation so far. I feel, I would be in a better position to answer this question maybe 6 months down the line. Yeah.
I think most organizations haven't quite seen it enough, to your point, to know where it leads to. What I've seen is there, and anecdotally also heard a lot of clients say, we have a lot of, new folks who just copy paste.
Yeah.
Like the output from AI, let's say a consulting firm is seeing that with their analysts and the senior partner looks at it and say, have you checked? Like, this makes zero sense for the project, right? And so that pattern recognition, though, gets today, or if historically gets built through you working through many, many projects and actually literally having to think through it. You don't really have that many reps to struggle through it to get to the answer. You somehow need to help the folks still build the pattern recognition, but shortcut it. And I think that's one of the challenges that a lot of organizations are facing.
I agree with you. I think that is a very real situation. You see many examples of that on an everyday basis.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I haven't come across any of those instances.
Hopefully, they remain minor when they do show up. I also want to talk to you a little bit about how you think about the benefits and the productivity gains through AI. How are you defining that today? Have you put in some systems to measure that? I'm curious about your perspective there.
I would say the way we are measuring the impact of, using these tools is to have a higher degree of throughput. Now, for examples, and, we're not using this as a workforce management mechanism to say, hey, now you have AI, and hence this is the impact on workforce. That's not the approach we have taken, but rather, we are going ahead with this approach to say, yes, jobs are evolving. And we would expect people to, let's say, create better output. And that's essentially what, Doug also said something very similar, which is to say, yes, jobs will change, but our workforce is going to, be almost the same. We're not seeing a lot of change in our workforce numbers. So I would say that, so the way we are looking at the impact is more in terms of, the quality of output that you produce, and as well as, are we moving, let's take a very tech specific example. Now we've got a tech roadmap for each of our, teams that are delivering for the business products. Are we moving faster on the roadmap? Are we, starting to deliver stuff today, that was probably planned for 3 months out? Has the quality of code gone up? Have the number of, operational issues gone down? So those are the things that we are tracking. We've got very strong mechanisms to, completely measure it and say, create causal linkages between tool usage and, output generated. I could see us get there eventually, but, it's going to take a little bit of a time. So when you're an early adopter and, you're trying to, get there, these are the challenges that, you sort of want to address a little down the line. And hence, I would see that probably again get addressed 6 months to a year from now. Yeah.
And in the organization, I know some organizations, there's a lot of leadership interest in seeing, is the investment we're making generating the returns? And so there's a lot of emphasis around that. In your case, how are you creating the leadership buy-in and the room to be able to experiment as you figure these things out?
That's a great question, Vince. So what I'm seeing is, for us, we consider this as the next stage of evolution as humans, progress forward. So for us, using Gen AI, Gen AI tools is a natural part of our evolution. So there isn't really any resistance on that. Now, to your earlier question in terms of the use cases, I would say when we are seeing these use cases, we are usually starting with a proof of concept. And then, you typically go the standard, consulting stuff that you do, which is, this is my investment, this is the ROI I expect, these are the outcomes. So we are approaching it from that perspective. I mean, the parallel to that would be, let's say, if you were to take a manual process and automate it and, invest in the automation of it, what is the ROI that, you generate basis the investment, and, is it worth it or not? So we are approaching it similarly, but there isn't resistance as such, in terms of POCs for Gen AI and saying, hey, like for me to actually go and, use this as a use case for Gen AI, there isn't really much resistance on that. Obviously, it's completely dependent on the POC you're talking about and what return do we see on that. So that's the way we're sort of approaching it. That being said, we are, doubling down in terms of the way we invest in AI. And I was talking about the 4 super agents earlier. And we are also, hiring for senior leaders who are going to help us and accelerate the AI journey, both in terms of, what does the outcome look like, and as well as, how do we adopt it? So yeah, so those 2 pieces I would talk about.
Honestly, sounds like a really exciting time because there's so much really important and interesting transformation. And another benefit, honestly, is Walmart has enough of a scale for you to actually generate real, almost research data on how this works, right? Like statistically significant data. How you think from a learning and development perspective as you're making this transition? Are you also involved in thinking through, okay, well, how do we develop our people in this case, and how do we change how we develop them from to? I'm curious for your thoughts.
No, that's a great question, Vince. From a learning and development perspective, a couple of things. One is, the competency model that I was referencing to. So we have refreshed the competency model very recently. And, the way we went about refreshing the competency model is we've brought in AI where AI integration is possible. And as a result, we have refreshed what those capabilities look like right across, all of the competencies that you'd expect a software engineer to have, right from, the requirement gathering, scoping analysis, code development, architecture, debugging, DevOps, and so on. I would say that's the start of it. Now that, we've completed that, what we'll do is the learning academy that we have will be two refreshes to that. One is, the content that we provide, that's going to be refreshed. Let's say now, coding looks very different from an AI perspective, right? Let's say the first draft of the code is going to be generated using Gen AI. That content is in the process of getting refreshed. Second is to the earlier point that I was making, where we are having active sessions of use cases and, talking to developers about, how do they, leverage these tools. The second part of that is going to be once we refresh the content, now that the capabilities are refreshed, we'll refresh the, learning content. We'll also be having adoption sessions in terms of, hey, this is the new content. This is what we encourage you to do. And that's where, a lot of effort is going to be. So that work is, work in progress at this point of time, Vince. But yes, that's the approach that we're taking towards learning and development. And this is more specific to, our tech population as such at this point of time.
One thing that I've had some conversations with leaders is what you actually have to develop people becomes in some sense actually harder in the new world, where like you actually are really teaching far more judgment and like higher order thinking than you maybe before. You actually teach the basics, and then while they work through the basics, they develop that sort of through the job. But now you still need to teach them the higher order thinking, but the ways in which you used to learn has been like shortcut in very significant ways. How do you think about that? I'm curious if that's a discussion you're having internally, and if so, how do you ensure that people get to the level at which they actually can effectively use AI and guide and get to higher levels of their role in this world?
Yeah. So, Vince, can you talk to me a little bit more about this problem statement you're talking about? Give me an example of that, then I'll be able to explain a little better. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll give an example from like a data analyst perspective. Back in the day, like by back in the day, I mean like a few years ago when there was no AI, you would as
pre-AI,
yeah, like pre-AI, you would get all the data, you would like build the model in a very particular way, and you would work on like the assumptions, making sure all the pages are structured correctly, and you would know inside out how the model is structured.
Right.
And so like where the linkages are, where the things are going to break, where the typical mistakes get made. And by the time you get to a manager overseeing an analyst, you can usually actually kind of see, okay, I'm going to review this analyst output, and I know the 5 places I should really look at because they're the 2 places.
Yeah.
Now let's imagine a world where fast forward, like AI is creating a lot of this already. So actually the person creating has no idea how the data is flowing necessarily. You still need to be able to spot check the outputs and actually make sure it makes business sense. But building that skill is a lot harder than building like the basic pivot tables and VLOOKUP in Excel, right? That's kind of what I mean, which is
got it.
When you have to get to a stage where your role is to provide sort of the high-level reviewer role, that's a lot harder actually to do than like just rote doing it in many cases. And then how do you teach people to do that effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and we've often talked about it. And the analogy that comes to my mind, Vince, is if you were to take a world, and it'll be very difficult for both of us to imagine, if you were to take a world, pre-calculator, people would be, using logbooks and, figuring out, log 2 is point 301, things like that. And then, once the calculator comes in, you do a log 2 and it gets you 0.301. You don't really care about, how log 10 is calculated, right? To answer your question, I would say most companies have very early stage adoption of how these tools are and how it's going to shape, because what you're talking about is a multi-year expertise building.
Right.
And today, those of our interns, joining from campuses and eventually becoming your first line software engineers or, first line associates. Your question is very valid because they actually seeing the rigor that goes into, building the output, because they're getting the first draft generated. So, the reviewer really needs to, be able to double down, and give them the feedback and so on. And they need to understand that. Now, honestly, I'll be super honest with you, Vince. I don't know how that dynamic is going to play out, because you will start to get this generation of experts or this generation of professionals who are basically, leapfrogging from a logbook to a calculator. and would never see, logbook ever in their lives. And, they would start with a calculator to begin with. So how do they know, whether log 10 is log 2 plus log 5? We would never know that. If the calculator gave a wrong output, there's no way for us to validate that. I think that's something that we'll have to work towards. I do not have a ready answer for you at this point of time. That for me is a higher order problem. If I was to look at the crawl, walk, run of this model, I would say that's more like a run situation.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
we'll get there. I think we'll eventually get there, but I think we're not there yet. I mean, when I mean we, I don't think any organization's there at this point of time.
Yeah, I hear organizations grappling with it more from the perspective of, especially like, for example, consulting.
Yeah.
Oh, we need fewer analysts, let's say, but how would we develop managers then?
Yeah.
Right? Like the pyramid used to make sense where it was like this, and so then you have people churn and leave and you have enough. But if it's a diamond,
Yeah.
right? I see organizations talking through that. So I suspect actually as organizations adopt this and start to have to promote people into more leadership roles, that's where the gap will become very obvious. Do you have enough people ready to lead, like conceptually and so on, or not?
I think, Vince, towards that, we've been very pragmatic in the way, we've looked at it. We've not reduced our, campus hiring or, any of those entry level, hiring numbers, because we know that this dynamic is eventually going to shape, and, and we don't want to take decisions that will be difficult to reverse at a later point of time. So we have continued with the campus hiring. We've continued to get in the entry level, talent in, and we've not made any significant changes to that yet.
I think that's very prudent and like long-term oriented. I see a lot of organizations that make a very short-term decision, but I think they'll pay for it. But not too far from today, right? Because promotions have to happen. Anything else, Arkesh, that you found very surprising as you embark on this skills-based transformation journey?
What's interesting is we are seeing a spectrum. When I see we, I mean the industry in general. I would make it more general, because I keep talking to my friends as well. When you look at across the industry, Vince, you'd see a large spectrum of adoption and reactions to how people are using Gen AI. The thing that surprised me, and this was a couple of weeks back, is in those organizations and in those roles where there is a headway where you can actually use Gen AI to take care, let's say, of the work that you don't want to focus on. And there's a higher order task you can take on. There, the inclination towards adopting AI is much higher compared to the jobs where the higher order tasks are not clear. I'll give you an example on this. Why my team is super excited about using Gen AI tools is because if they do that, they will be able to focus a lot more on the strategic aspects of it and the org design, on the leadership building aspects of it, and the work that takes away time that goes away into some of the work that can be leveraged using Gen AI. That's what the motivation is. That's the piece that surprised me a little bit. Like if there is a job where the higher order tasks are not clear, that's where there's a little bit more of a resistance in terms of the Gen AI adoption. And jobs where the higher order tasks are a lot more clearer and there is a visibility vision towards it, the pull factor for that is a lot more higher.
That's super insightful, and that makes total sense to me. You need to give people something to look forward to. Then they embrace the change. But if you're saying like, oh, things are gonna change, but like what's remaining for is very unclear, then it's obviously going to be a lot of resistance. I love that. Arkesh, thanks so much for joining today and sharing really your on the ground experience leading this right now, grappling with lots of things that are undefined and uncertain. But I really admire how you're shaping sort of this journey for such a large organization, sharing that experience with us.
Sure. It's a pleasure being on a podcast. And yeah, I look forward to seeing you next weekend. Yeah.
Sounds good. Talk soon.
Talk soon. Bye.